Terence Okafor was 41 years old, and until that Saturday evening, he believed his marriage was simply going through a rough patch. He drove a 7-year-old Honda. He wore Carhartt jackets and worn Timberlands. His wife Lydia called him a property manager, and he never corrected her. What she didn't know was that her quiet, overlooked husband owned 207 properties across Georgia and North Carolina, worth $34 million in equity, structured through 6 separate LLCs. She didn't know because she never once asked. That evening, Terence came home to find his college best friend, the man who gave the toast at their wedding, sitting in his living room, drinking his bourbon, and rather than beg or break down, Lydia pointed at the door. "This is my apartment," she said. "I pay the rent here. Get out." Terence looked slowly around the apartment, at the floors he'd laid himself, the fixtures he'd personally sourced, and picked up his bag. What Lydia didn't know was that she had just ordered a man out of his own building, and she had no idea what that was about to cost her. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Through the morning haze, Terence Okafor walked the perimeter of Cascade West Apartments, his worn Timberlands crunching against the loose gravel of the parking lot. Steam rose from the thermos his mother had given him years ago, the one with Nigerian proverbs etched into its surface. The familiar weight of his Carhartt jacket settled comfortably on his shoulders as he made his routine inspection. A U-Haul truck caught his attention, parked awkwardly near Building C. A young woman struggled with a box that seemed too heavy for her frame, her face pinched with worry. Terence recognized that look, the one people wore when everything they owned was in transit, when their whole life was suspended between what was and what might be. "Need a hand?" he called out, keeping his voice gentle. She startled, then offered a relieved smile. "Oh, thank goodness. Yes, please. These boxes are heavier than I remembered." Terence set his thermos down and moved to help. Together, they carried boxes up to apartment 3B. She introduced herself as Maya, a first-year teacher at the nearby elementary school. Her hands shook slightly as she fumbled with her keys. "First time living alone?" he asked, steadying a box labeled Kitchen as she worked the lock. "That obvious?" She laughed nervously. "Everything's so expensive these days. I was surprised to find something this nice in my budget." Terence nodded, thinking of the below-market rate he'd insisted on keeping for essential workers. He didn't mention that he owned not just this building, but the entire complex. Instead, he said, "The property manager here is good people. You picked a solid spot." They moved boxes for the next 20 minutes. Terence noticed the building's small imperfections as they worked. A loose handrail that needed tightening, a crack in the hallway paint that wanted touching up. He made mental notes, would email his maintenance team later. When they finished, Maya thanked him profusely. "Are you the maintenance man?" she asked. "Something like that," he smiled. "Welcome to the building." Walking back to his car, a Honda Accord with 112,000 miles on it, Terence checked his phone. 2 missed calls from his property management company about a lease renewal and a text from Lydia. "Don't wait up. Brunch with the girls." He slipped into the driver's seat, the leather worn smooth from years of use. The car could have been replaced 3 times over, but it ran fine and drew no attention. Like him, it did its job without flashiness. Through the windshield, he watched a Mercedes SUV pull into the lot. Lydia's car, bought new last year. She'd insisted on it, called it an image requirement for her pharmaceutical sales job. The morning light caught her as she stepped out, highlighting the designer bag on her arm, the careful arrangement of her hair. She was beautiful, had always been beautiful, but lately her beauty felt like armor, something she wore to keep distance between herself and their life together. Terence watched her walk to their apartment, never glancing in the direction of his car. She hadn't asked where he was going this morning, hadn't looked up from her phone when he'd mentioned checking properties. In 8 years of marriage, She'd never once asked which properties, never wondered about the quiet empire he'd built from that first foreclosed duplex he'd bought at 27. He lifted the thermos to his lips, reading the proverb his mother had pointed out when she'd given it to him. A patient man will eat ripe fruit. The coffee was still warm, strong, and black, just like his father had taught him to drink it during those early mornings when they'd talked about working twice as hard to get half as far. Terence had learned different math. He'd learned that silence could be currency, that being underestimated was its own kind of compound interest. He'd learned it watching his parents, his father in warehouses, his mother cleaning office buildings, how the world looked past them, never seeing their dignity, their intelligence, their quiet power. He took another sip of coffee, watching Lydia disappear into the building he owned. She'd been on her phone again, smiling at something on the screen. That smile, bright, genuine, was different from the polite one she gave him these days. He noted the difference the way he noted everything. Carefully, without reaction, filing it away with all the other small details that told larger stories. The morning was still young. Terence had 3 other properties to check today: meetings with 2 potential sellers and a conference call with his real estate attorney. He would do it all without fanfare, without flash, building in the shadows where he'd always built best. The setting sun cast long shadows across the Cascade West parking lot as Terence pulled his Honda into his usual spot. He'd finished his property rounds early, the day's tasks completed with his characteristic efficiency. But something was off. 3 spaces down, a gleaming black Porsche Cayenne caught the fading light. Brick Holloway's car, impossible to mistake with its custom wheels and personalized plate. Brick Dev. Terence's hands stayed on the steering wheel, his breathing steady. He noticed everything, as he always did. The position of the Porsche, angled slightly askew, like it had been parked in a hurry. Brick's designer briefcase visible in the back seat, probably empty. Brick always carried it for show. The time on the dashboard, 6:47 p.m. For 11 minutes, Terence sat motionless in his car. He thought about the bourbon he'd given Brick last Christmas. Small batch, expensive, the kind of gift that said you knew what someone liked. He thought about their college days, sharing a dorm room, Brick already practicing his developer's smile. He thought about his wedding day, Brick standing beside him as best man, raising a toast to forever. At 6:58 p.m., Terence picked up his property inspection notebook and walked to Building A. His footsteps echoed in the stairwell, concrete he'd had resurfaced last spring. The hallway carpet, new last year, muffled his approach to 4C. His key turned in the lock with familiar precision. The living room lamp cast warm light on a scene that seemed arranged for maximum impact. Brick lounged on the leather couch, the one Terence had carefully selected for its durability, holding a crystal rocks glass filled with amber liquid. Lydia stood by the window in her red silk robe, the one she saved for special occasions. The air felt thick with expensive cologne and betrayal. Terence closed the door quietly behind him. His eyes moved methodically around the room, noting details like he was conducting another property inspection. The bottle of bourbon on the coffee table. His bottle, half empty now. 2 glasses, lipstick on one. The slight disarray of the throw pillows his mother had picked out. "Terence!" Lydia's voice came out sharp, defensive. She didn't move to cover herself or act surprised. Instead, her chin lifted, shoulders squaring for battle. "You're home early." Brick said nothing, just watched from the couch with the satisfied smile of a man who believed he'd already won. He swirled the bourbon in his glass, the ice cubes clinking like small bells. "I've been unhappy for years," Lydia continued, her words practiced, rehearsed. "You must have noticed. How could you not notice? You're never really here, Terence. Even when you're home, you're just existing. No ambition, no drive, just fixing other people's properties, living small. Terence stood perfectly still, his property notebook still in his hand, the fresh inspection notes visible on the open page. Building C, repair needed on Unit 2B dishwasher. Brick understands what I need, Lydia pressed on, gaining momentum. He's building something real, making actual moves in this city. When's the last time you even tried to move forward? When's the last time you wanted more than just getting by? She gestured around the apartment with mounting frustration. I pay the rent here. I keep us in a decent neighborhood. You contribute when it's convenient. But this is my apartment, Terence. I need you to pack whatever you need and get out. Get out of my apartment. Terence's eyes moved to the walls. Benjamin Moore. Revere pewter. He'd chosen it himself, applied 2 coats personally. The hardwood floors he'd had installed in 2019, sourced from a supplier in Charlotte, who gave him contractor rates. The brushed nickel fixtures he'd picked for their timeless quality. Every inch of this space bore his fingerprints, though not in ways they could see. Without a word, he walked to the hall closet and retrieved a black duffel bag. Always packed, always ready. It was something his father had taught him. A wise man knows the weather can change without warning. Brick finally spoke, his voice thick with bourbon and victory. Come on, man. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Terence paused at the door, his hand on the knob. The property inspection notebook weighed in his other hand, full of notes about buildings that appeared in no joint tax returns, no shared financial statements. He looked back at them, Lydia in her silk robe, Brick with his borrowed bourbon, and spoke softly, clearly. Make sure your rent is on time. The door closed behind him with a gentle click, leaving them in their confusion. In an apartment they thought they understood. The craftsman home sat back from the street, sheltered by old oak trees that filtered the last rays of sunset. Terence's Honda looked at home in the simple concrete driveway, nothing about the understated exterior suggesting the careful renovation work he'd overseen himself. He climbed the porch steps, each board solid and quiet. He'd replaced them last summer, selecting the lumber personally. Inside, the house breathed quality without shouting it. Original hardwood floors gleamed under soft lighting. The kitchen featured classic subway tile and professional-grade appliances chosen for longevity rather than flash. Every detail spoke of someone who understood true value. Terence moved through the space with familiar ease, selecting a crystal tumbler, better quality than the one Brick had been using, and a bottle of Blanton's bourbon he kept for evenings like this. The back porch beckoned, its deep overhang protecting comfortable seating that overlooked a garden his mother had planted with herbs and flowers. The bourbon poured amber in the fading light. Terence settled into his favorite chair, letting the evening wrap around him like a well-worn jacket. From here, he could see the raised beds where his mother grew peppers and tomatoes, the careful pathways he'd laid between them, the irrigation system he'd designed for optimal coverage. This was his sanctuary, titled under East Point Holdings, LLC, one of 6 limited liability companies he'd structured with meticulous care over 14 years. Lydia had never seen it. She'd never asked to see any of his properties, never shown interest in the work that took him across the city and beyond. The portfolio spread through his mind like a map. 207 properties, each one selected, acquired, and improved with careful strategy. Multifamily complexes in growing neighborhoods, single-family rentals in stable areas, small commercial strips positioned for long-term appreciation. From Metro Atlanta to Macon, Augusta to Charlotte, every investment reinforced the others. It had started with that first duplex, a foreclosure he'd found in 2009, when the market was bleeding and opportunities were everywhere for those patient enough to look. $12,000 in savings, earned from 3 years of living lean and working maintenance jobs. 8 months of nights and weekends, learning plumbing, electrical, flooring. He'd lived in one unit and rented the other, banking every dollar of profit. Terence took a slow sip of bourbon, remembering those early days. The duplex had led to a small quadplex, then another duplex, then a small apartment building, each property generating revenue, each revenue stream feeding the next acquisition. He'd built his empire like his father had taught him to build anything, slowly, correctly, with attention to every detail. Now, Cascade West Properties LLC alone held 12 buildings, including the complex where apartment 4C sat. His buildings, his terms, his strategy. While Lydia dismissed him as someone who fixed toilets, he'd assembled a portfolio worth $34 million in equity. While she complained about his contributions to her apartment, he'd been quietly growing his holdings through 6 carefully structured LLCs, each one documented with surgical precision. Setting down his glass, Terence reached for his laptop. The property management software opened to a familiar dashboard. Every building, every unit, every lease tracked with characteristic thoroughness. He navigated to apartment 4C's records, something nagging at his memory. There it was. 6 months ago, a lease renewal processed at 12% below market rate. The note from his property manager jumped off the screen. Tenant requested rate review, referred by B. Holloway. Terence sat very still, letting the implications settle. Brick knew which management company handled the building. He'd known for months, maybe longer. This wasn't a spontaneous betrayal born of passion or opportunity. This was calculated, orchestrated. Brick had been moving pieces on this board while sharing Terence's bourbon and calling him brother. The laptop's glow illuminated Terence's face as he created a new folder on his desktop. His fingers moved across the keyboard with deliberate precision, typing 2 words that would become a mission: Broderick Holloway. His expression didn't flicker with anger or pain. Instead, his features settled into the focused calm of a man who had built an empire by seeing what others missed. The same patience that had assembled 207 properties now turned its full attention to understanding exactly what Brick had been trying to accomplish. The garden sprawled dark and fragrant beyond the porch. Somewhere, a nightbird called. Terence reached for his bourbon, his movements unhurried. He had time. He had always had time. Sunday morning light streamed through the craftsman's kitchen windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. Terence stood at the counter, his mother's coffee maker gurgling steadily. He'd always appreciated how morning felt different in this house, peaceful, removed from the world's complications. Today, that peace felt like the calm before something larger. He poured his coffee into a heavy ceramic mug and pulled out his phone. Nadine answered on the second ring, despite it being Sunday. That was one reason he'd chosen her years ago. She understood that real estate never slept, and neither did the people who built empires from it. Nadine, sorry to disturb your Sunday. You never call on weekends unless it matters, she said, her voice carrying its usual precise clarity. What happened? Terence took a slow breath, then laid it out chronologically, finding Brick's car, the confrontation in apartment 4C, Lydia's claims about ownership, and finally, the lease renewal note that had caught his attention. The property manager's note mentioned Brick by name. Nadine's tone sharpened with interest. Referred by B. Holloway. Direct quote. Give me an hour. I'm calling Winston. While Nadine worked her connections, Terence made breakfast. Simple eggs and toast, his father's Sunday standard. He was halfway through when his phone buzzed. Conference call. You need to hear this, Nadine said without preamble. Winston's voice joined in, carrying the focused energy he reserved for significant findings. I pulled every real estate transaction attempt connected to Brick's development company over the past 3 years. Winston began. There's a pattern. He's been trying to acquire specific properties along the West End corridor, all through different shell companies, all rejected because the owners wouldn't sell. Which properties? Terence asked, though he already knew. Every single one is held by one of your LLCs. He's been circling your holdings without knowing they're yours. But here's where it gets interesting. 3 months ago, he submitted a development proposal to Atlanta's City Planning Office. Mixed-use project requires eminent domain on 2 buildings. My buildings, Terrence said quietly. Your buildings, Winston confirmed. The proposal was rejected, but the attempt tells us something. He's been trying to find leverage into that corridor for years. Nadine's voice cut in, crisp with new information. I've got something else. I had my assistant pull the social connection timeline. Brick didn't just happen to introduce you to Lydia 8 years ago. He'd already identified you as a quiet but significant property holder in Atlanta real estate. The introduction wasn't casual. It was strategic. Terrence set his coffee down slowly. Explain. He started tracking your early acquisitions around 2012. By 2015, he'd figured out you were building something substantial, but he couldn't crack your LLC structure. Then suddenly, he's playing matchmaker? Bringing Lydia to that dinner where you met? That wasn't coincidence. She wasn't the target, Terrence. She was the access point. The kitchen felt very still. Outside, a cardinal landed on the feeder his mother had hung, bright red against the green garden. The affair, Winston added quietly, is just the final move. He's been positioning himself for years, getting close through your marriage, watching your routines, trying to figure out which properties you control. He's been running an operation, not an affair. Terrence absorbed this in silence. 8 years of dinners, basketball games, backyard cookouts, all of it groundwork for something else. Every time Brick had called him brother, he'd been mapping another angle. Every time he'd asked casual questions about property management, he'd been probing for weaknesses. Nadine, Terrence said finally, his voice level. I need you to begin divorce filing preparation. Everything by the book, clean and clear. And I want every business move Brick makes monitored. New permits, loan applications, investor meetings, everything. Already on it, Nadine replied. And Terrence, Georgia may be an equitable distribution state, but your LLC structure is airtight. Lydia has no claim on any of it. She never asked to have one, Terrence said softly. 8 years, and she never once asked what I was building. The cardinal took flight, a flash of red disappearing into the oak trees. Terrence watched it go, thinking about visibility, about what people see when they choose not to look closely enough. Keep me updated, he said simply, and ended the call. Monday morning sunlight filled the corner window at Café Lucia, where Lydia stirred her oat milk latte with practiced elegance. Across the small table, her best friend Cora leaned forward, perfectly manicured hands wrapped around her own cup, eyes wide with anticipation. So you finally did it, Cora said, her voice a mix of excitement and practiced concern. You actually told him to leave. Lydia adjusted her designer blazer, a recent gift from Brick, and nodded. I had to. 8 years of watching him just exist. No drive, no ambition. Do you know he still wears those same worn-out work boots? To property visits? Girl. Cora shook her head sympathetically. And Brick is so different, Lydia finished. He actually makes something of himself. Did I tell you he's working on this huge development project in the West End? That's a man with vision. She took a careful sip of her latte, remembering how Terrence used to drink coffee from that old thermos his mother gave him. Even his coffee habits had embarrassed her. And honestly, she continued, warming to her audience, I deserve this. I've spent 8 years trying to push Terrence forward, trying to get him to want more. But he's content just managing other people's buildings. Meanwhile, Brick is out there making actual moves. Cora nodded supportively, exactly as Lydia knew she would. That afternoon, over lunch with her sister Paulette at Marcel's, Lydia repeated the story with slight adjustments, emphasizing Terrence's emotional distance, his lack of presence. He was just there, Lydia explained, gesturing with her fork. Physically present but checked out. Brick actually sees me. Paulette's response wasn't quite as enthusiastic as Cora's had. Terence always seemed present to me, she said carefully. At family dinners, holidays. That's because you didn't live with him, Lydia cut in smoothly. Trust me. What you saw was the surface. I needed more. I deserved more. She called Terence that evening from her car, keeping her voice businesslike. I wanted to discuss the apartment situation, she began. Of course, Terence replied, his tone surprisingly pleasant. What do you need to know? I'd like to stay through the end of the lease, if that's okay. I can handle the rent on my own. That's fine, he said simply. Whatever works best for you. The lack of resistance bothered her more than she expected. The next morning, she called him again, this time about collecting some of his remaining things. No rush, he said, that same easy tone. Take your time. Over drinks with Cora that evening, Lydia laughed about it. He's being weirdly chill about everything. I mean, I expected at least some fight. He probably knows he can't do better, Cora offered, signaling for another round of cocktails. Men like that, they're just limited. Lydia nodded, feeling validated. Brick's taking me to St. Bart's next month. Can you imagine Terence even knowing where to book in St. Bart's? The next morning, feeling confident and secure in her decisions, Lydia called the property management company. The woman who answered sounded efficient and professional. Hi, yes, I'm Lydia Okafor in 4C, she began. I wanted to discuss the possibility of subletting my apartment. Of course, the woman replied. May I ask who the potential subtenant would be? Broderick Holloway, Lydia said, enjoying how the name sounded. He's a local developer, very established. I'll need to submit this request through our standard channels, the woman said. We'll need to run background and credit checks and get approval from ownership. That's fine, Lydia said breezily. I'm sure it won't be a problem. Brick's financials are excellent. She spent the rest of the day feeling accomplished, texting Brick about furniture arrangements and planning which of her things would look best with his aesthetic. That evening, she and Cora browsed online for new apartment decor, planning the upgraded life she'd finally claimed for herself. Meanwhile, across town, Terence sat at his desk in the Craftsman House, reading an email from his property manager. The subject line was simple. Sublet request, Unit 4C. He opened the attached form, noting Brick's name listed as the potential tenant, and added it to his growing folder of documentation. Without comment, he picked up his phone and scheduled a morning call with Nadine. The garden outside his window was dark now, but he could still make out the shape of his mother's roses against the night sky. The modern glass building that housed Nadine's law office reflected the morning sunlight like a mirror. Terence sat across from her broad mahogany desk, while Winston arranged documents between them, his CPA's precision evident in every movement. Let's be clear about what we're protecting, Nadine began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had won this battle before it started. When did you purchase your first property? 2009, Terence replied. The duplex on Cascade. Winston nodded, pulling up a spreadsheet. 6 years before the marriage. That property was acquired through your first LLC, which was formed the same year. We have the original operating agreement right here. And the subsequent properties? Nadine asked, though she knew the answer. All acquired through the same structure. Winston explained. 6 separate LLCs, each with clean operating agreements, perfect tax compliance, and 0 commingling with personal or marital assets. He turned to Terence. You never even deposited a rent check into your joint account. Because it wasn't joint business, Terence said simply. Nadine leaned forward. Georgia is an equitable distribution state. That means fair division, not necessarily equal. But, in this case, she gestured to the stack of documents, there's very little to divide. Your joint checking account has $14,000. You have 1 car titled to both of you. Everything else? She spread her hands. It's not marital property. What about appreciation? Terence asked, though he already knew. Winston shook his head. The property's appreciated significantly, yes, but that appreciation occurred within the LLCs. Since you never mixed business and personal finances, never used marital funds for business purposes, and maintained perfect separation of accounts, he smiled. The appreciation stays with the businesses. She has no claim on any of it, Nadine confirmed. The portfolio is completely protected. Terence nodded, thinking of all the times Lydia had dismissed his work without asking a single question about it. And the apartment? She's a tenant, Nadine said flatly. Nothing more. Her lease is with Cascade West Properties, LLC. The fact that you're her landlord doesn't change her legal position at all. They spent the next hour reviewing the divorce petition. Nadine's paralegal brought in coffee. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the office. I'll file this today, Nadine said finally. She'll be served by certified mail, probably this evening. Terence stood, straightening his jacket. Thank you both. You built something remarkable here, Winston said quietly. We're just helping you protect it. Leaving Nadine's office, Terence checked his watch. He had time before his next meeting. He drove to Westview Gardens, one of his smaller properties, a well-maintained complex of 16 units. Miss Regina lived in Unit 3, ground floor. She'd been there 4 years. He knocked gently. When she opened the door, her face was tired, but her smile was genuine. Mr. Terence, she said. I wasn't expecting you. Just checking in, he said. How are you feeling? Better this week. She touched her headscarf unconsciously. The doctors say the chemo is working. That's good news. He glanced around her apartment. Neat as always, family photos on every wall. The rent reduction will stay in place as long as you need it. Just focus on getting better. Her eyes welled up slightly. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. He smiled. Let me know if you need anything else. His next stop was Highland Park Apartments, where Mr. James and 2B had just returned from a 3-month stint in county jail. A misunderstanding about an old warrant that Terence had helped him sort out. He'd held the unit, knowing Mr. James had nowhere else to go. Back at work? Terence asked, standing in Mr. James's small kitchen. Yes, sir. Started Monday. Mr. James stood straighter. Won't let you down on this second chance. I know you won't. Terence checked the sink fixture he'd had replaced last week. How's it working? Perfect. No more drips. Driving back to his house, Terence thought about protection, what it meant to guard something you'd built, but also what it meant to extend that protection to others when you could. He had never been cold. He had simply learned to be careful. At 6:45 that evening, Lydia signed for a certified letter. Standing in her kitchen, their kitchen, she still thought, she opened the envelope and stared at the divorce petition. Her hands began to shake as she read the words, Petitioner, Terence Okafor. She grabbed her phone and dialed Brick immediately. The next morning, Lydia sat in the polished offices of Marcus and Wheeler, watching Patricia Wheeler review the divorce petition. The attorney's manicured nails tapped thoughtfully against her desk. We'll need to request a full asset disclosure, Patricia said, looking up. Standard procedure. Lydia nodded, confident. Of course. There's not much to disclose. He's a property manager. Patricia made a note. We'll see what the documentation shows. Sometimes spouses keep things separate that should be marital property. Within hours, Nadine's office responded with a meticulously organized digital folder. Patricia opened it, expecting the usual middle-class asset list. Her eyebrows rose steadily as she scrolled. Ms. Okafor, she said carefully, I need to discuss these disclosures with you. When Lydia arrived 30 minutes later, Patricia had spreadsheets displayed on her monitor. Your husband has 6 separate limited liability companies, Patricia began, all formed before your marriage. Each holds multiple real estate assets. She turned the screen. These are clean entities with perfect documentation. The separation between business and personal finances is absolute. Lydia stared at the screen. He had businesses. He has 6 business entities, Patricia corrected, with significant holdings. What does significant mean? Patricia pulled up another document. The properties are held through different LLCs, Cascade West Properties, Highland Development Group, East Point Holdings. She paused. Each entity owns multiple properties, all acquired and managed independently of marital assets. But I'm his wife, Lydia said, her voice smaller now. Georgia law is clear on this. Assets acquired before marriage, especially business entities maintained separately, remain separate property. There's no commingling here, no joint business decisions, no shared management. Patricia folded her hands. These are his assets, not marital property. Lydia sat back, her designer purse sliding off her lap onto the floor. She didn't pick it up. That same week, across town, Brick Holloway sat in his corner office reviewing the final draft of an acquisition offer. The West End corridor was heating up, and he'd identified a prime target. A well-maintained apartment complex managed by Southern State Property Management. The offer's aggressive, his attorney said. 20% below market. Brick smiled, adjusting his Rolex. The LLC owner is anonymous. Probably some passive investor who inherited it. They'll take it. He signed the offer letter with a Mont Blanc pen and handed it to his attorney. Send it to Southern State. Let's see who comes out of the woodwork. The offer arrived on Nadine's desk the next morning. She called Terrence immediately. Brick Holloway just submitted an offer on Cascade West, she said without preamble. Want me to hear the number? Please. She read the offer amount. There was a pause on the line, then a soft chuckle. Don't reject it, Terrence said. No? String it along. Keep the seller anonymous. Let him think he's closing in on something. You want him invested, Nadine said, understanding. I want him committed. Handle the due diligence process normally. Just maintain the LLC privacy protocol. Over the next 2 weeks, Brick's team conducted their review. They requested operating statements, maintenance records, capital improvement histories. Nadine provided everything promptly, professionally, through standard channels. Then came the rent rolls. Brick's attorney, David Chen, spread the tenant list across his desk. His eyes caught on Unit 4C. Tenant, Lydia Okafor. He frowned, recognizing the name. Brick, he called. Take a look at this. Brick strode over, designer shoes clicking on hardwood. He scanned the document. Unit 4C, David said. Isn't that just a coincidence? Brick said dismissively. Common name. The deal's proceeding exactly as planned. He straightened his Italian silk tie. Draft the purchase agreement. I want to close this month. David watched Brick walk back to his office, shaking his head slightly at his client's unshakable self-assurance. He made a note to review the tenant list more thoroughly later. But Brick had already moved on, calling investors about his imminent acquisition. The rent roll sat on David's desk, apartment 4C's entry visible. Tenant, Lydia Okafor. Lease. Term, 12 months. Monthly rate, $1,850. Notes. Rate adjustment approved per B. Holloway referral. Ms. Brathwaite's kitchen smelled of oxtail stew, a recipe unchanged since Lydia was small. The familiar aroma filled the modest Decatur home where both Brathwaite girls had grown up, where Sunday dinners were still sacred, where truth had always been non-negotiable. Terrence parked his Honda at the curb, the manila folder on the passenger seat heavy with more than just paper. He checked his watch, 6:45 p.m. Early, as always. Through the window he could see Paulette helping her mother set the table, their movements comfortable and routine. Lydia's Aunt Marie's car was already there. He took a slow breath, picked up the folder, and walked to the door. Ms. Brathwaite answered his knock with the same warm dignity she'd shown him for 8 years. "Terrence," she said, pulling him into a brief hug. "Come in, son." In the dining room, Paulette gave him a quick, uncertain smile. Aunt Marie nodded from her seat. They all felt the weight of why they were here, but none of them knew its true mass yet. Lydia arrived 7 minutes late, dressed carefully in a cream blazer that probably cost what her mother made in 2 weeks. She faltered slightly, seeing Terence already there, then recovered with a practiced smile. "Mama," she said, kissing her mother's cheek. "I didn't realize we were starting so early." "We start when people arrive," Ms. Brathwaite said simply. "Sit." The table was set for 5, the good plates out, water glasses filled. Ms. Brathwaite had made cornbread, too. Terence could smell it keeping warm in the oven. The familiar domesticity of it all made what he had to do both harder and more necessary. "Before we eat," he said quietly, "I need to share some information with the family." He opened the folder with steady hands. The first document was a printed email chain between Brick and his development team, discussing strategy for acquiring properties in the West End corridor. Terence's name appeared in the 3rd paragraph, identified as a quiet but significant holder of key parcels. 8 years ago, Terence began, his voice even, Brick Holloway introduced me to Lydia at a restaurant downtown. What I didn't know then was that he had already identified me as someone whose property holdings he wanted to acquire. He slid the email across to Ms. Brathwaite. He had been watching my investments for months before that dinner. Lydia's face went still. "What are you talking about? What holdings?" "I own 207 properties across Georgia," Terence said simply. "Through 6 companies I built before we met." Brick knew about some of them. He wanted them, and he saw you as a way to stay close enough to eventually take them. The silence in the room was absolute. Paulette's hand covered her mouth. Aunt Marie reached for her water glass, but didn't drink. Terence continued, laying out document after document. The development proposal targeting his buildings, the lease records showing Brick's involvement, the timeline of the affair overlaid with his business maneuvers. "He didn't pursue you because he loved you," Terence said, looking directly at Lydia. "He pursued you because you lived in my building, moved in my world, and never once thought to ask what I actually did." "That's not," Lydia started, but her voice wavered. "We were unhappy. I deserved—" "Lydia." Ms. Brathwaite's voice was very quiet. "What have you done?" "Mama, you don't understand. Terence was never there. He was always at those properties, always in those work clothes, never trying to be more." "I was present," Terence said softly. "You never looked." He stood, straightening his jacket. "Not Carhartt today, but well-tailored wool. The folder is yours to keep. Everything is documented. I thought you should know the whole truth, not just Lydia's version." "Terence," Paulette said, her face stricken with a shame that wasn't hers to carry. "I'm so sorry. We should have—" He shook his head once, gentle but final. "You didn't know because I chose not to show it. That's not on you." He turned to Ms. Brathwaite. "Thank you for having me in your home all these years. You raised your daughters to value integrity. One of them still does." He walked to the door, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood. Behind him, he could hear Lydia beginning another attempt at explanation, could hear it dying under her mother's silence. He didn't turn back. The night air was cool on his face as he walked to his car. Through the window, he could see the family tableau continuing without him. Ms. Brathwaite still seated, one hand on the folder. Paulette, with her head bowed. Aunt Marie looking at Lydia like she'd never seen her before. And Lydia, standing now, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling in the face of documents she couldn't deny, and a mother's disappointed silence she couldn't escape. The morning sun filtered through the craftsman's kitchen windows as Terence made his coffee. His mother's roses were visible from where he stood, their early blooms catching the light. He picked up his phone and dialed Nadine. "Good morning," she answered on the first ring. "How did the family dinner go?" "As expected," Terence said, measuring his words carefully. "I need 2 things executed today." He heard papers shuffling on her end, knew she was already taking notes. "Go ahead." First, accept Brick's offer on the Cascade West complex, but modify the final contract to include the standard seller disclosure paragraph. I want my name, Terrence Okafor, sole member of Cascade West Properties LLC, revealed at the closing table. Clean and legal, Nadine confirmed. The disclosure is standard procedure. When do you want to schedule closing? 2 weeks. Let's not drag this out. Terrence poured his coffee, the familiar motion grounding him. Second item, I need a 60-day notice of non-renewal issued to Apartment 4C. Standard Georgia form, no cause required. Sign it as Cascade West Properties LLC and have it delivered today. Consider it done. He could hear Nadine's small smile. You're letting the legal documents do the talking. They're more eloquent than I could be. After hanging up, Terrence sat at his kitchen table. The morning quiet wrapped around him. He thought about Lydia's face at dinner last night, the moment her carefully maintained story began to crack. He thought about Brick's confidence, built on assumptions no one had bothered to verify. The sun climbed higher, warming the hardwood floors. His phone buzzed at 2:47 p.m. Lydia's name lit up the screen. Hello, Lydia. What is this? Her voice was sharp with confusion and something closer to fear. I just got a notice from Cascade West Properties saying my lease won't be renewed. Who are they? Why are they? That's my company, Terrence said simply. The silence stretched for 3 full seconds. What do you mean, your company? I mean, I own the building, Lydia. I've owned it for 6 years, along with 206 other properties across Georgia. He heard the sound of her sitting down, probably on the couch he'd helped pick out when they first moved in. The leather one she'd insisted would elevate the space. That's not, she started. You're a property manager. You fix things and collect rent and… I own things, Terrence corrected quietly. I build equity. I create housing. I employ property managers. You never asked for the details, so I never corrected your assumptions. Another silence, heavier this time. Terrence. His name came out different now, softer, with the beginning of understanding. The deposit will be returned promptly, he said, his voice professional and distant. You have 60 days to find new housing, per Georgia law. The notice includes contact information if you have any questions about the move-out process. He ended the call before she could respond. In apartment 4C, Lydia sat on the leather couch, staring at the notice in her hand. Her eyes moved over the room, the crown molding she'd complained about until Terrence had it installed, the hardwood floors she'd assumed came with the unit, the updated fixtures she'd credited to good property management. All of it his, all of it part of a portfolio she'd never bothered to understand. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up her phone. She scrolled to Brick's number, hit call. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. A third time. Nothing. The apartment felt different now, the space around her charged with new meaning. She thought about Terrence in his work clothes, checking properties on weekends. She thought about his quiet competence, his attention to detail, his patience with her dismissal of his work. She thought about the folder he'd left with her mother, full of evidence that Brick had seen what she hadn't bothered to see. The notice sat on her coffee table, her name typed neatly at the top, 60 days spelled out in clear terms, the LLC signature at the bottom representing more wealth than she'd ever imagined living with. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating all the questions she'd never asked, all the assumptions she'd never examined, all the value she'd never recognized until it was no longer hers to claim. The 14th floor of Midtown's glass-wrapped Morrison building housed Nadine's law office. Her conference room commanded views of the Atlanta skyline, a deliberate choice that reminded clients of the power concentrated in this space. At 10 a.m. sharp, Brick Holloway strode in with his usual entourage, his attorney James Chen, and 2 junior associates carrying leather portfolios. Brick wore a navy Brioni suit and a smile that had already celebrated this victory with potential investors. He'd spent the last 2 weeks laying groundwork, describing this acquisition as the cornerstone of his West End development strategy. The confidence rolled off him in waves. Nadine sat at the head of the conference table, elegant in charcoal gray, a single manila envelope placed precisely before her. Her expression gave away nothing. "Beautiful morning for a closing," Brick announced, claiming his chair with the ease of a man who believed he owned every room he entered. His attorney sat beside him, reaching for the envelope. "Standard disclosure package," Nadine said, her voice professionally neutral. "Please review before we proceed." James Chen opened the envelope with practiced efficiency. His eyes moved across the first page, stopped, moved back up. His hand shot out instinctively, gripping Brick's forearm before his client could speak. "What?" Brick asked, smile faltering slightly. He pulled the document closer. There it was, in clean typescript. Seller's Identity Disclosure. Terence Okafor, sole member. Cascade West Properties, LLC. The color drained from Brick's face in steady degrees. His eyes darted to the door just as it opened. Terence walked in. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, not a trace of Carhartt, not a hint of the property manager Brick had dismissed for 8 years. He moved with the quiet authority of a man who had built something lasting while others were busy performing success. He sat directly across from Brick, adjusted his cuffs, and met his former friend's gaze with calm precision. "Good morning," Terence said. Brick's mouth opened, closed. The junior associates shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "Before we proceed," Terence continued, "I am exercising the seller's right to rescind this offer prior to final execution." He slid a single page across the polished mahogany. "Effective immediately." Brick's attorney reached for the document, but Terence wasn't finished. He placed a second, thicker folder on the table. "This is a formal complaint filed this morning with the Georgia Real Estate Commission," Terence said, each word measured and clear. "It details material misrepresentations made in your West End development proposal, specifically regarding property ownership and eminent domain implications." Brick's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Sweat beaded at his temples. "Additionally," Terence continued, "your investment partners at Meridian Capital, Southeast Ventures, and the Turner Group have been made aware of these misrepresentations. Winston Adeyemi provided them with comprehensive documentation yesterday." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Everyone present understood what this meant. Without those partners, Brick's entire development structure would collapse. His financing would evaporate. The reputation he'd built on projected deals would crumble. "You can't," Brick started. "I can," Terence said simply. "I did." "We were friends," Brick tried, desperation creeping into his voice. "Best friends. I was your best man." "Exactly." Terence's voice could have frozen water. "You introduced me to my wife. You were the best man at my wedding. You have been in my home. You have eaten at my table. And you spent 8 years trying to figure out what I had so you could take it." He stood, buttoned his jacket with precise movements. "You still don't know what I have." The silence that followed was complete. Nadine gathered her papers without hurry. Terence walked to the door, his footsteps quiet on the carpet. He did not look back. Behind him, Brick sat motionless, staring at the documents that represented the end of everything he'd built. His attorney was already on his phone, damage control mode engaged. The junior associates looked anywhere but at their boss. The morning sun continued to pour through the windows, illuminating the space where Terence had sat. The chair still pulled out slightly, as if to mark the moment a man everyone had underestimated finally showed his full measure. Atlanta's skyline stretched beyond the glass, a city where power changed hands every day. Today, it had shifted silently, definitively, in a conference room on the 14th floor. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.